It is now my pleasure to welcome today's speaker to share his expertise and knowledge about the drug discovery and development process. Dr. Roham Zamanian is an associate professor of pulmonary and critical care medicine and the director of pulmonary hypertension service at Stanford University Medical Center. I think we'll get started with one question that we received some questions ahead of time. And so I will read one of the questions that we have ahead of time to just kick things off. So the question is, what happens to the results from a clinical trial after the trial is done? How can I find out the results of a clinical trial that I participated in?
So thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. Typically, the clinical trials that are conducted, once the clinical trial is over, we don't have a magical answer. It takes a little while for the statistical analysis and then the publication of those data, scrutiny of it first and then the publication. So typically there is a little bit of a delay, even a year or so, maybe after the study has been finished. Now, remember, it's a processed enrollment. It's a chronological enrollment. So you may be one of the first patients in and one of the first patients out. So you may have to wait longer for that data to come back. You have to wait till that last patient finishes the clinical trial before at least some preliminary. Typically, the data is published in journals such as the Journals of the Pulmonary Hypertension Association, the American Journal of Respiratory Critical Care Medicine. Sometimes the big ones are the New England Journal of Medicine. They're very medicalese, and if you have medically good confidence in your medical understanding, then that's okay. Sometimes they're presented at international conferences. I've seen not only at the PHA International Conference, which is great for patients, but I've also seen patients at our American Thoracic Society meetings and American Heart Association and others that occur. So all of these go into saying that the data is disseminated by presentations and publications. Now, the one point here that I think we all agree on is there are times when drugs don't do well or a study fails. And often because of investor issues, the data from those trials is not published. I've been involved in some of those, and boy, that ticks us off as physicians. So I think this is something that we need to work as a community to make sure there's full transparency around publication of trials. And remember, we can learn from failure as well as from positive results. So look out for publications and presentations in journals, at society conferences. Ask your physicians, and ultimately, talk to people who can impact the world if the studies are not being published.
What are the main reasons why a drug will not progress to human trials?
So sometimes drugs won't progress to human trials because the efficacy around them in animal studies or preclinical studies are just marginal. You're not seeing the signal that you want to see to invest the time and effort into doing human clinical trials. Human clinical trials are expensive and time consuming. So you want to have a lot of trust in the fact that you believe that there's a good signal there. There are other times that the drug, as I said, is great, but it's not safe. That you begin to pick up liver or kidney or other safety signals, and that's really why they don't make it to human clinical trials. Now, if the question is why doesn't it make it to phase 2 clinical trials, is also another question, because probably is the safety and tolerability. Why doesn't a drug make it out of a phase 2 clinical trial to a phase 3 clinical trial? Probably because, one, either that the efficacy wasn't demonstrated, or two, and the reality of this is not the greatest reality, but it exists, that there isn't a good business plan and a business model to support the development of that medication. That happens sometimes. And that's when we believe that it's the responsibility of our government and the National Institute of Health to promote those medications that are maybe generic or don't have the business plan that goes along with them.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so this question is around terminology. Can you explain what it's meant by standard of care?
Oh, absolutely. With every disease that we take care of patients, there is a medical standard of care. For diabetes, the standard of care is at least to make sure that the blood sugars are tested and that blood sugars are well controlled, either through exercise, diet, medications. In pulmonary hypertension, the standard of care is I follow you in an appropriate way. I have enough experience to follow you as a patient to provide care and resources to you, and that I give you the medications that are indicated, and I don't give you the medications that might be toxic for you. One of the #1 issues in pulmonary hypertension is the use of medications when they're not indicated. Sometimes it's a hard story to tell, but sometimes patients have lung disease that's causing their pulmonary hypertension. There isn't an approved drug for that condition yet. Sometimes there is heart disease that's causing the pulmonary hypertension. So we have to be good advocates for you from a medical standard part of things, and that's what standard of care is. Currently, the standard of care in a patient with pulmonary hypertension is at minimum 1 medication, sometimes the initiation of 2 medications, and if you needed 3 medications, and the standard of care requires that we provide you access to a lung transplant if you need that, and if you're a candidate for it. That's what's meant by standard of care.
That's great. Okay, so next, at what point are PAH patients included in clinical drug trials?
So so it depends on the clinical trial. Actually, I would have to say that. Most clinical trials want patients to have some stability. When you're on maybe 1 or 2 medications and you're stable, or even 3 medications, that's stability. There's nothing magical about it has to be 2 years in, or you got to be on so many drugs. There's sometimes stability. Some therapies take the next chance and they say, yeah, we need you to be sort of stable, but severe that we're worried about you progressing. So it all depends on what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria of the clinical trial. And you as a candidate, as a potential patient in those trials, you absolutely have the right to understand what those inclusion and exclusion criteria are. And your physicians can explain to you. Usually there's a list of like 50 of each, maybe sometimes. So you might have a little bit of time to read through it, but that will be in information that they can provide you.
This is a related type of question, is that if you join a clinical trial, who watches over your care, your doctor or the clinical trial doctor?
So that's a really great question as well. At Stanford, what we do is me and one of my other colleagues are mainly the clinical trial physicians. We have 3 of us actually. We work with our coordinator and we supervise the care of those patients. But we also don't have you stop seeing your regular doctor. I may be your regular doctor as well as your clinical trial doctor. So we'll put those appointments together and do that. So in a clinical trial, you need to be continually evaluated by the routine care physician. Now, your physicians, even your clinical trial physicians, will know that you're in a clinical trial, but we won't know if you're getting the real drug or not unless it's an open label clinical trial. It's not a placebo-controlled. Placebo-controlled trials are usually blinded. So nobody knows what the drug is. Even the sponsors don't know who's getting what. It's only the pharmacies that know what's being given. So, so absolutely, you should continue to have your care that's provided. Now, the one thing about it is some data that's developed as a part of your clinical trial will never be seen by your regular physician because they're not supposed to see that information. And they're not supposed to use that information to make major clinical decisions. Vice versa, sometimes our clinical activities do inform what's happening with the clinical trial. for example, if a patient comes in and I see you and you need to be hospitalized, that we tell that to the clinical trial team as well. And that's certain actions for clinical trials. So I would suggest to you with pulmonary hypertension, depending on where you are in the model of care that your PH center has, first of all, please, please, please be seen by a physician who knows the disease, who's accredited by the PHA. And if you can't see that physician routinely, then we work in collaborative manner. So you could be in a clinical trial at Stanford, but be seen by a pulmonologist in Sacramento. That's okay with us. And we will take care of you as the best as possible.
That's great to know. There are a number of questions that are related to drugs that are coming down the pipeline that are in development now, and whether there are some examples of drugs that are in clinic now and coming through the final stages of development.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't want to get very specific on clinical specific trial drugs, because then you have to be equally informed about all the studies that are out there. One thing I do want to tell you is that in general, there's the development of drugs that in PH work on the same pathways that historically we've had approval, but you'll begin to see drugs, and maybe drugs that are considered disease modifying or impact the disease from a different mechanism being tested more recently. And you'll actually even maybe hear about immune therapies that are based on the fact that we think that there is inflammation and autoimmune disease in pulmonary hypertension. So I would really say be on the lookout for new clinical trials, and recognize you have your choice. Recognize what trial you want to participate. You want the comfort of knowing that the mechanism has worked in the past, so I want to be in that trial, or be in a trial where it's a new and novel mechanism.
Yeah, and we can put a plug in too that PHA has a clinical trial finder tool on our website that'll help you be able to see what trials are open and enrolling patients near where you live, and your doctor might be involved in that.
And could I say, Elizabeth, there's another thing I want to mention. Just because a clinical trial is being conducted doesn't mean it's a clinical trial for a therapeutic indication. Remember, people these days are more and more interested in diagnosing disease early, so that you'll hear about the use of powerful artificial intelligence and electronic medical records to inform physicians that there is a risk of pulmonary hypertension maybe developing or being early signal. People are often interested in, these days, wearable devices. What is it? How can it affect patients if they are monitored at home with their exercise activity through their simple watch? I won't plug our trials, where you could find it. There is a variety of other studies, some that want to look at the role of how you feel symptomatically for therapies in the future. A patient-related outcomes tool that the FDA is really interested in developing as an endpoint for clinical trials. So it doesn't mean a clinical trial is always a therapeutic testing. There's registries like the FAR registry, and there are all these devices and artificial. You'll see a breadth of information come down in the very near future on other unique trial opportunities for you.
Great. Okay, so the next question that we have is revolving around the complications that PH patients may have with multiple illnesses. So the question is, don't most trials require that a patient only have one illness in the trial drug being tested, meaning PAH without overlapping diseases such as autoimmune or prior cancer histories?
I think that's a really good question. So that's all in the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and it depends on the people who are designing the study. So now, it's not always so clear or so bona fide that if you've ever had a cancer, you can't be part of a PAH clinical trial. Sometimes the less malignant cancers, well, they would include you in a trial if the cancer was maybe 5 years resolved and in remission. There's always a line in clinical trials that the physician who is considering enrolling the patient in a clinical trial has a say to what the morbidities or comorbidities of that condition are. So, yeah, we know that 50% of patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension, you all, have some form of thyroid disorder. Does that mean that you don't participate in clinical trials? No. If there was a trial that invoked somehow the thyroid gland, then maybe, and it's very mechanism based. So there isn't one answer to that question, but typically the design of the trials are fairly reasonable, especially because we know that PAH is such a rare disease. We're not vying to exclude more patients. Just because you have 6 toes doesn't mean you can't be in my clinical trial. I have 6 toes, by the way. But just kidding.
These 2 questions are related. One is from Jacqueline, who says, how do you, as a doctor, determine what clinical trials are right for your patients to take part of? And the other question is related to this. What kind of questions should a patient ask their doctor if they're interested in becoming part of a clinical trial?
Excellent ideas, questions. So, there are a lot of different things in terms of when a physician decides that they want to be part of a sponsored clinical trial. We're not talking about academic stuff in the laboratory, which is our own homegrown brew, if you will. You have to think about, I look at the guidelines and the protocol that a sponsor has developed, and I see, okay, do I have a lot of these patients? If they're asking for a lot of patients, for example, with the subcondition, for example, maybe HIV and pulmonary hypertension, we don't have a lot of HIV patients at Stanford. I don't know why, but we just don't, and we're not plugged into our HIV collaborator. So that's something that I can't promote very well. And obviously there's resources that I have to be able to do a clinical trial. In terms of what the conversation that a patient should have, I think is very, very simple. I think one, just remembering to, there's a lot going on in a clinic visit. You're getting medication started or discontinued or ramped up or ramped down. You don't feel well. But if you have it in your mind to ask 2 quick questions. One, what pulmonary hypertension clinical trials are you, as a center, do you have access to? And can I participate in those? And if you don't have any clinical trials, where do you think I can learn about those clinical trials? Or do you know of clinical trials that I would be a good participant? Me as your advocate and any PH-aware physician would know that if I don't have a clinical trial, but I know there's one being done at UCSF, which is right up the street from us, I can call up my colleagues at UCSF and say, I got a great patient for you who's very, very interested. So part of it is around the knowledge of your physician, and part of it is around your awareness to ask that question. If you ask the question and you don't get a satisfactory answer, I think that's where a Pulmonary Hypertension Association is trying to come in, but also that's where all the other regional centers are coming in. You should be able to get a second opinion at a PH center of excellence, whether it's a comprehensive care center or a regional center. The day and age is here that you should have a center of excellence. And the way that the Pulmonary Hypertension Association has gauged the participation of those centers, those physicians will be knowledgeable about trials, and if they don't participate in a specific trial, they can get you a referral to other trials. So it's a conversation. It's remembering to ask that question. And to be frank, you should expect from your physician to have the knowledge and the time to discuss that with you. If they don't, find yourself another physician.
Great. That's great advice. And thank you so much for all of the great input and answers to these questions. And I want to thank our audience who came up with some wonderful discussion questions today and very engaged in the conversation. And again, one more time, I'd like to thank Dr. Roham Zamanian for a very informative and engaging presentation and a wonderful Q&A time.